And we are live. Welcome to the Monster Report live here on YouTube and on Facebook. And we are glad you're here with us. It is here on the eastern seaboard of the United States. It is 10 p.m. and we're glad you're here. And just joining on the chat, we've got a great discussion episode for you today. Let us know in the chat that the audio is coming through just fine, and even with the noises I've got here in my office, my little makeshift office that I've got here tonight, we're going to be especially talking about some of the Toho cast that we have lost in recent years. Specifically, recently we lost Mary Teruyoshi Nakano, and we've lost also Mr. Takarada and many others. And so I just thought we should bring in, a special guest who's had the chance to actually had the experience with them, had the chance to interview a lot of them, and just get a different perspective on things, and especially from the fact that our guest actually lives in Japan and can bring that perspective to us, both cultural and from the filmmaking side of things, and just his experience. So we'll bring in our guest in just a minute, but just letting everyone know that Monster Report's a show highlighting those entertaining creatures of film history. And my name is Nick Adam Poling. Yes, that is my real name. And we are glad you're here. So without anything further, like, subscribe, comment, and join in on the chat as we bring in our special guest, Mr. Brett Homenick. Brett, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well, Nick. How are you doing?
I'm doing excellent, and I really appreciate your time that you've given us to bring your perspective in on the show today. We lost Mr. Nakano recently, Mr. Takarada, and it's it is just part of life, but at the same time they've left such a legacy, such an impression in our lives, and I know you've had the chance to meet quite a bit of the original show, especially Toho cast and others. And I figured that it would be a good time to bring you in and kind of talk to you. I know you have Vantage Point Interviews, and we've had you on the show before and you've kind of discussed it, but maybe if they're new to this show, could you kind of describe what Vantage Point Interviews are?
That's a very good question. It was a website I started in 2015, having just a lot of interviews that I've conducted over the years since about 2004. And I wanted to get these interviews out there on the internet so that they could be accessed easily and be useful to people, because a lot of them were published in old fanzines, and really unless you had that particular fanzine on hand, you weren't going to see anything that I had written about or anything that any of my interviewees had talked about. So I thought that was a bit of a waste. So I wanted to put it out there. I decided on the name Vantage Point Interviews specifically because it was a little generic. And the reason is because I wanted to have the freedom to interview anybody I wanted. Writing for some of the fanzines that I had in the past, I found it was a little bit limiting because ultimately your editor would say, oh, well, I don't think I want to have an interview with that person. That's a little bit too off topic, or maybe he just wasn't interested in the subject matter that you were going to cover. So instead of having to deal with any limitations, I wanted to have no limitations. So if I want to interview a politician, which I haven't done yet, but I like history, I like politics. So I wanted to leave the door open for interviewing anybody. And I do have interviews on my website that have nothing to do with Japan or Japanese films. So if I called it something like Tokusatsu Talks or, whatever, I wouldn't have been able to do those topics, and I would have limited myself. So yeah, I thought Vantage Point Interviews sounded good. It actually, the inspiration came from the name of the autobiography of former President Lyndon Baines Johnson, whose autobiography is called Vantage Point. And I thought, Vantage Point Interviews, kind of has a kind of nice ring to it. And so I just chose that.
Oh, that's interesting. And you don't, I guess the same thing even with a YouTube channel, if you call yourself Godzilla this or Tokusatsu this, and there's plenty of those kinds of podcast YouTubers, content creators that do that. That's why I kind of thought Monster Report, because I love everything monsters, but I didn't want to limit myself to maybe the kaiju side of things, or even just the American side of things. So leaving it the generic monsters. But I've also said that human beings can be monsters too. So I can even review a film like Psycho or any of the Hitchcock films that have human monsters in them. So and that includes dinosaurs as well, can be monsters, and Masters of the Universe has monsters in it. So I get what you're doing there. And so having lived in Japan and taken in the culture and the fact that you get to interact with a lot of these the Japanese filmmakers, cast members, and being able to get their perspective on things. Obviously, today our big subject would be on Mr. Nakano, and kind of tell me about the brief interview you did get the chance to have with him, what that was like, and kind of where it went from there.
Okay, well, actually, I've had 3 interviews with him overall. The first 2 were done in 2004 because he was a guest at a convention at which I was a volunteer, and I was lucky enough to do the interview with him on stage, and also one behind the scenes sort of after the convention. And we split it up so that the first interview would be about his Godzilla work, and the second interview would be about non-Godzilla topics. The problem with the first interview is the translation wasn't up to par. And I do have the bulk of the recording of the first maybe 3/4 of it, but that's in storage in the US. I've been communicating with the person who shot it, and he recently moved, and so he's not sure if he can dig up the original recording or not. So I want to get that original recording retranslated eventually. I'm still working on that. I did get the final, let's say, quarter of that interview retranslated, and I think it's much clearer and much better than it was. But another part of that issue is that when he talks about Godzilla vs. Gigan, Megalon, Mechagodzilla, Terramechagodzilla, the person who recorded the first part of the interview decided to stop recording, so that's lost to history, and there's no way to get that. So there's just so many problems associated with that. And the second interview behind the scenes, I think that went better. I think the translation, because I think that the original translator was trying to play to the audience a little bit, trying to be a little bit more entertaining than accurate, if you understand my meaning. Mm-hmm. So behind the scenes, there was no audience to play to. There was no one to entertain. So I think he was able to focus more on the details and be a little bit more professional and be a little bit more accurate. So I'm fairly happy with that. But again, that recording is lost to history. The person who recorded it on an audio recording actually stopped recording when the Japanese started happening and only started recording when the English translations came up. So even if that recording still existed, I wouldn't be able to get that retranslated anyway. But I'm reasonably satisfied with that one. I think that one's okay. And that one is, you can find that on my website under An Explosive Career in an interview with Teruyoshi Nakano. The first one is a look back at the Godzilla series, which again, that one I'm still a little bit iffy with some of the translations on the first 3/4 of it. But I think you still at least get the gist of what he said probably. And I'll get into some of the things a little bit later that he talked about. The one that you're talking about that I just posted, and if people want to go to VantagePointInterviews.com, they can see it. It's the very first interview that will pop up. It was actually something that I remember that I had, but I actually forgot about how detailed it was, because at the time, a few of us were doing a 35th anniversary tribute to Terror of Mechagodzilla. So we were working on this in late 2009. So my partner at the time, who goes by the name Totoro, who was a Japanese living in America at that particular time, helped me with some translations and some contacts with people associated with Terror Mechagodzilla. And I was able to give him my contact with Mr. Nakano, and he was able to set up a telephone interview with him based on my questions. So I sent Totoro my questions, and he arranged the telephone interview with Mr. Nakano, and Mr. Nakano sort of gave that brief interview on Terror of Mechagodzilla. So I misremembered that as maybe like a 1-paragraph statement where he basically talked about how wonderful it is that people still remember Terror of Mechagodzilla, 35 years later. But when I actually went back and looked at it for this podcast, I was kind of shocked. I was like, oh, it's actually an interview. I could use this. I could publish this on my website. So it was actually a very wonderful find, and I actually have this podcast to thank for it. So thank you very much for inviting me on, because I was able to add new content to my website, and I'm always happy to add new content whenever I can. So thank you very much for that.
Well, and I appreciate the fact that it is out there. Like you said, you could publish it in a fanzine, and unless you picked up that copy, during the time, and a lot of these things go out of print, the web is always going to be there, and even if it gets deleted, there's an archive somewhere out there that's probably got it stored. So that's really great to be able to see that on VantagePointInterviews.com, correct?
Absolutely. And also I'd like to plug the Facebook page too. If you go onto Facebook and just type in Vantage Point Interviews, I think right now we're only at 61 likes. So smash that like button, as they say on YouTube. And, like, I'm not a self-promoter. I'm no good at that. Like, I can't, it's just not my thing. So if anyone wants to do it, if you want to see the updates of when I've got a new interview, and there are going to be some interesting interviews coming out in the next few months. I've got a lot of stuff in the can. It just takes a lot of time to just dot the I's and cross the T's, double check things. I don't throw stuff out there. I try to be as accurate as possible, which is hard to do when you're dealing with translating from one language to another, especially when you get into the details of tokusatsu. It can be very, very difficult to really get all the details right, but I try to do it as accurately as I can. So it does take time, but I've got a lot of stuff in the can that's coming out. Even an interview with Nobuyuki Yasumaru, who is one of the people we've lost this year, one of the people that maybe we'll touch on later. I interviewed him in September of last year, and of course he died on March 1st of this year. So, it might be his last interview ever. I don't know that, but in any case, certainly it was my last interview with him. And I even wanted to think about doing a part 3 with him. I thought, there's already one interview with him on my website, which you can read. And there was enough meat left on the bone that I was able to schedule a part 2, and we talked about more things. That will be coming out, I hope, in the next few months. But again, there's a huge backlog of stuff. But eventually everything will be coming out. So you can go onto the Vantage Point Interviews Facebook page. And when that stuff is published, you'll be the first to know about it if you like the page and subscribe to the updates. I sometimes also post photos that are interesting. And so that stuff is out there too.
And that photo that you have of Mr. Nakano, that was one I think you took during the interview, and I think he has himself a nice portrait of himself, I'm assuming, during the years that he was Mr. Tsuburayas' successor.
Well, that was during the years that it looked like in that particular drawing, it looks like he was probably at the time that he was chief assistant director, because he looked fairly young in those photos. And actually, it wasn't taken as part of any interview. It was taken at one of the many times I was able to meet him at various events in Japan. Somebody had given him that drawing, and it was done in December 2015. That was when that photo was taken. And actually, again, during the research, I forgot about that photo. There's just so many things. Like, I really went through the archives and just dug through stuff. Didn't even remember I had that photo. And then as I was researching things, like, wow, that's a really great photo. And I was like, okay, I'm using that one for the interview. So again, it was a telephone interview, so there was no photos associated with that. So I just had to dig up whatever I could find, and then, just use that to have some sort of illustration for the interview. And when I found that, I was like, oh, that's perfect. I got to use that one. And so I did. Yeah. But that was another find that I only found because I was doing research for this podcast. So it's been, even for me, it's been very educational. I really like that.
And before we get into some of the career aspects, just from your interaction and experience with them, I've even noticed, despite the fact that I don't speak much of the Japanese language, much less than probably even most tokusatsu fans, but personality comes through, and mannerisms, kindness, accommodation, things like that. How would you describe Mr. Nakano if I were to have met him personally? Unfortunately, I did not get the chance to meet him. I know some people have had the chance to meet him. One year I knew he was at G-Fest and made a lot of great interactions, and that was great to hear about those stories. But kind of tell me about your interaction with him personally, and how would you describe him?
He was a lot of fun, and he had a very friendly personality. But I think in maybe the last year or so, he kind of lost a step. And that's not to say that he became less friendly or anything, but you could tell that maybe he would get a little bit more tired than he used to. I actually, again, another photo I found when I was doing research was from about 2017, I guess. And it was a picture, like somebody had brought like this big Shin Godzilla toy. It was like a really big thing that you'd have to hold in your hands like this. And, you know, as I was going in to pose for a picture, it was his idea that like, oh, you know, you should kiss the tail of this. So in the photo, I'm holding the toy, kissing the tail, and Mr. Nakano has like a big smile on his face. And he was very playful, very friendly. You know, there are other people that I've met who've been very businesslike, you know, who have, you know, only been interested in people to the extent that they can sell them something or make money off them. And he wasn't a businessman. He wasn't there to sell anything. He was just there to share tokusatsu. He loved his fans, I think, as much as they loved him, as we loved him, I should say. And he was just a very friendly person, and he loved to laugh. He loved to have a good time, very open-minded. And again, I can go into some of my stories a little bit later to give people a little bit more of a specific idea of what he was like. The interesting thing about, you mentioned his going to American conventions, and I believe I'm pretty sure I'm not mistaken, but I think he's only done 3 conventions, which if you think about how long he was healthy and just how much he was involved with tokusatsu, that's just incredibly bizarre. I can't explain that. He went to G-Con in 1999. That was his first time. The convention run by John Rocco Roberto, which I think to this day still reflects sort of like my ideal. Like if I were going to be running a convention and bringing guests to America, that's the type of convention. It's too bad people don't remember G-Con very well or John Rocco Roberto, but I think he was probably the best at running conventions in terms of what I've seen. And he also did a convention in New Jersey in 2002. And then, of course, as you mentioned, he did the Chicago convention in 2004, which I believe it was his last one. I don't think he did a convention after 2004, which is interesting to me. I do know that at that convention, I think the consensus was that maybe, I don't know, like, you know, he was friendly, but he wasn't, as I would usually say, bouncing off the walls. You know, like sometimes if you look at old footage of Haruo Nakajima, you see him like, you know, dancing around with people and, you know, really having a good time and you know, really sort of, you know, joking around with people. And Mr. Nakano wasn't that way. And I think maybe people thought that he was a little bored of it, or maybe he wasn't that enthusiastic about it. But I mean, I was involved in that convention for a few years in terms of booking guests. And I can tell you honestly, his name never seriously came up after that. Like, oh, we should bring back Mr. Nakano. And I think maybe for other people, like he wasn't that impressive as a guest. And it's unfortunate that he lived almost 20 years after that. And as far as I know, and I'm pretty sure I'm correct, he was never invited back to another American convention. So I think it was a missed opportunity for people.
No, I think so too. And it would have been, yeah, he would have been someone I would have really connected with because, you know, it's everyone's starting point. Where did they kind of start with Godzilla, Rodan, Mothra, any of these tokusatsu, or even the, you know, new CGI? You know, maybe you were a new Godzilla fan, a new kaiju fan, and you started with the CGI Legendary series or Shin Godzilla. But, you know, my starting point was 1984, Godzilla versus Gigan, Mechagodzilla. So that's where, you know, so his visual effects, his hand on the visual effects of things, the suits and the miniatures, all of that is where my starting point was. So that's where I really find myself connecting with him. And I would probably have just a world of questions to the point of probably exhausting him, because that would be, you know, again, my starting point. And it's interesting, you know, when you look at his career, it doesn't just span post, well, I guess it would have been after All Monsters Attack, essentially, when he took over as visual effects director. But prior to that, he goes back as the assistant. What was it? As far back as, was it King Kong versus Godzilla? Or Mothra?
Yeah, I mean, I think maybe actually Gorath, so a little bit earlier than that. But, you know, he was an assistant director on the drama side going back to 1959.
Okay.
at Toho, and he worked with Kurosawa on Sanjuro. So he was an assistant director on an Akira Kurosawa movie. So he had a lot of experiences, and he knew a lot about Toho. He was basically a walking encyclopedia, and he loved talking about it. So you're saying that you would have worn him out. He would have worn you out explaining this stuff to you. I mean, it's just, you know, he loved talking about this stuff, and he knew it. And from 1963, I mean, you think about it, like he started in tokusatsu. He was moved to the tokusatsu side in 1962. By 1963, he was the chief assistant director. That's how quickly he got promoted. And he was under that Tsuburaya learning tree from 1963 up until the very end, up until the very end of Tsuburaya's work at Toho. So, you know, people think, oh, the 70s and what, that was so cheap and chintzy. This guy was Tsuburaya's chief assistant director for probably most of everyone's favorite movies who are watching this. So regardless of what you think about the quality of the 70s movies, there was no better person to ask about what Mr. Tsuburaya was like or what his technique was like during the heyday of the 1960s. But, you know, people just want to focus on Megalon or other things. I don't get it, and it certainly sells him short in terms of what his contributions were and in terms of what he actually did in the genre and what his knowledge was. But yeah, you're right. You know, if you just think about him in terms of like 1973, you're really missing the point because he was heavily involved in a lot more than that.
And so, yeah, you just kind of started talking about the growth of how he advanced so quickly, going from the drama side to the tokusatsu side, learning under the master, Mr. Tsuburaya, and obviously anyone who would be in the shadow of Mr. Tsuburaya, you know, would be very blessed with the fact that he is learning the tricks of the trade from the man who really invented this idea of suitimation and using the miniatures and models and really creating the depth of field of how to make this camera accurate, to make it photorealistic. And so kind of talk about how his growth from there progressed in keeping in mind the change in what was happening in Japan, the film industry, the budgets, and all of that, and then how that led to maybe the end of his career with 84.
Well, you know, let's go back to the very beginning because I've done some research on this, and specifically for this podcast, let's go back to the very beginning. Like, let's talk about his life and starting from the very beginning. So, Mr. Nakano was born on October 9th, 1935 in Manchuria. Now, if you go to the IMDb, it says he was born on October 1st, 1935 in Manchu, Korea. Manchu is just the Japanese word for Manchuria. Manchuria is not in Korea, so I don't know where that comes from. But anyway, you know, that's why you shouldn't trust the IMDb. Not always the most accurate thing. He was an only child. His father worked for an affiliated company of the Manchuria Railway called International Transport. His father was, Mr. Nakano described his father as a quiet and a not so strict father. And his father was a record collector. So he liked music. He was very into music. And so Mr. Nakano in his youth would listen to some of these records like, you know, Beethoven and other types of recordings from a young age. And so he spent most of his young life in China up until the end of the war. After the war, his family repatriated to Japan. And eventually they relocated to Kyoto, which is where Mr. Nakano went to junior high school and high school. Now, when he was in Kyoto, something very big happened in his life that probably inspired the rest of his career, that inspired the rest of his life. He saw two movies that had a very big impact on him. One was The Third Man, which is an Orson Welles classic, not directed by Welles. I believe it was directed by Carol Reed. But starring Orson Welles and Joseph Cotten, who, funnily enough, went on to appear in Latitude Zero, a Toho production. And one thing that really caught Mr. Nakano's attention about this film was that a zither, which is a musical instrument, was the only instrument used on the soundtrack. And that was very inspirational to him, and he really liked that fact. And another movie that it probably would be a little bit surprising to most people if you think about Mr. Nakano's later work with tokusatsu and explosions and things. But another movie that he really liked was what's called in Japan a home drama. They call it a home drama, but it's an RKO release called Our Very Own from 1950. It's not a very notable movie in the U.S. It's probably best known as like as an early appearance of Natalie Wood as a legitimate child actress before she became famous for West Side Story and Rebel Without a Cause. But Mr. Nakano actually likes home dramas. You know, that's like one of his favorite genres. He likes watching movies about families, not about explosions. So, I mean, again, I think, you know, that's, if you look at his work, I mean, it certainly doesn't reflect that, but we'll talk about that. I mean, Mr. Nakano wasn't a tokusatsu person. He wasn't into special effects at the time that he joined the special effects side. It was out of necessity that he joined. Like Toho just simply moved him over there, but his aspirations were not in tokusatsu. They were just in regular filmmaking. So, and not only that, some other titles that he was into, he also liked Abbott and Costello. He liked Abbott and Costello comedies at the time. So perhaps he even saw Abbott and Costello meet Frankenstein. Maybe he was a monster kid, you know, who knows?
Could have been.
Could have been. So he also liked Tarzan, which is not surprising. Tarzan was a very popular title in Japan. I've talked to other Japanese people who were alive at the time who saw Tarzan as children, so that's not so surprising. And there's also like a comedic actor named Enoken that Mr. Nakano really enjoyed. So you can see these are the types of movies he was watching. He wasn't watching tokusatsu movies necessarily. You know, it was a lot of home dramas, a lot of comedies and things like that. You might be interested to know this. Actually, in junior high and high school, Mr. Nakano was a bit of a jock. He played American football. And he specifies in his autobiography, it's American football, because usually when a Japanese says football, they mean soccer. But he wrote American football, and which is kind of unusual for Japan because soccer is much more common, baseball is much more common, but he played American football. And apparently there were actually some scouts from different universities who came out to, I guess, look at him and maybe try to recruit him. But he had decided by then he was going to basically going to go to film school. Like he wanted to join the film industry, and that's where he set his sights. So in 1955, he enrolled in Nihon University College of Art in the film department, specializing in screenwriting. Now, something that gets talked about a lot, but I think it's a little bit overblown, is the fact that Mr. Nakano worked on a movie called Night School, which is a 1956 Daiei release directed by Ishiro Honda. Perhaps you've heard of him. I don't know. Maybe he has something to do with this. And a lot of people, like especially when Mr. Nakano died, they say, "Oh, well, his first credit was Night School. His first assistant directing job was Night School." He was 1 year into college when the movie came out, so he probably didn't have a lot to do with it. I mean, it was basically like an apprenticeship. You know, it's a way to get sort of like you get some experience in the field, actually doing some of the work. And in his autobiography, he doesn't spend much time at all talking about his night school experience. So I don't think there's really anything involved. Like he was a college student. He wasn't a Daiei employee. He hadn't passed the entrance exam. He was a college student. His involvement was very minimal. So I think that gets overblown, but I have seen other people say, "Oh, well, his first credit was Night School." You know, but you have to keep that in context. And he would graduate in 1959. So that was, 3 years after Night School was released is when he finally graduated.
Would you say, if I could kind of interject there, just saying with his credit being to that, and you're saying more of an internship kind of role, I mean, maybe his duties were to the point of carrying scripts or props or who knows what in just a more, I guess we call it technical assistant sort of way behind the scenes, not really creative side of things, because I couldn't see a college intern having a creative role in a film like this, but interesting that it was for the competing studio, Daiei.
Well, don't forget, it was for Daiei, the competing studio, but at this time he had zero connection to Toho. So correct. That's important to keep in mind. At the time, it wasn't really thought of in that way. Yeah, like as you said, like his involvement would have been very minimal. And usually an assistant director's job isn't a creative position anyway. Maybe a chief assistant director would have a voice, and maybe the director would listen to it. But usually the assistant director, even the chief assistant director's job, is usually just to carry out the decisions and the wishes of the director. But I mean, in this case, he wasn't even a legitimate studio employed assistant director. So yeah, I think his involvement was very limited. So I think it's worth mentioning. I do think it's an interesting point, but I think it gets overblown and out of context. It might sound like, oh, well, Mr. Nakano was working as an assistant director well before his Toho days. But again, it was part of the college program. He was, like about a year, if that, into his lessons. So, we shouldn't read too much into that experience. That's the only point I would like to make about that.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, they gave him the connection to Ishiro Honda, and interesting that even the competing studio. This was 1955, correct?
1956 is when the movie was released.
So 56, and he's working with a Honda on that probably during either the year 56 or 55, even post Toho's Godzilla or Gojira. So I assume that with the studio system, and its kind of ownership over cast members, I guess directors, musical directors, behind the scenes people. This is kind of just me thinking out loud here. Are they not kind of contractually obligated in the same way, or are they more like what today our Hollywood system would be like, where everyone is essentially a for hire contract, essentially? Filmmaker or cast member, because Honda was obviously working for both Toho and Daiei in this case, right?
Yes, and some actors did too, like Takashi Shimura also did work for Toei in the 60s. And so there were some people who would, go in and out. I mean, in the specific case of Mr. Honda and, some of the others, I don't know what their contract status states. I do know that when I was actually researching this, I did have a document that Yoshimitsu Banu sent me when he was preparing his autobiography about 10 years ago. And there is an English version and a Japanese version. And I was reviewing this document in preparation for this. And he mentioned that the contract that Tomoyuki Tanaka had given him, and I don't have the notes here because obviously it wasn't about Mr. Nakano, so I didn't Mr. Nakano, so I didn't really pay that much attention to it. But it did say something like, if we, Toho, don't give you a certain amount of work within a certain amount of time, you are free to find work somewhere else. So, but this is the height of the studio system. I mean, the idea that Mr. Honda wasn't getting enough work at Toho when Toho was at its peak. And Toho was releasing, I believe, 2 movies a week around this time, if I'm not mistaken.
Wow. Which
is an amazing, because Toho during this time is MGM in the 30s.
Right.
Completely, it's run exactly the same way that MGM in the 30s was run. So there, it couldn't have been for lack of work. But again, in Mr. Honda's specific case, I mean, it's a good question. I don't know what the circumstances were, but it would have been after Godzilla, that's for sure. But yeah, I can't really speak to that. So I'm sure there's people out there who know much more about Mr. Honda's life than I do. So they would be the people to ask about that.
Yeah, but at least the connection was made there that they both ended up at Toho Studios, both working together. Especially through the Showa series there, and and obviously Mr. Nakano worked under Jun Fukuda, and let's see, so if he started with Toho in '62. Yeah, okay, so he would have worked with at least those 2 directors and probably other directors on other special effects films that maybe I'm not thinking of off the top of my, maybe not so much a tokusatsu, but other special effects work, correct?
Oh yeah, I mean, he worked with everybody, and don't forget, like for about 3 years or so, he was working on the drama side with directors. So, he worked under Mr. Honda, he worked under Mikio Naruse. As I mentioned, he even worked under Akira Kurosawa. So, and that's all on the drama side too. And Shuei Matsubayashi as well on the war film. So, he worked under, Mr. Fukuda as well. So even not just under the tokusatsu side, obviously he worked with Mr. Fukuda and Mr. Honda later on as tokusatsu director on other projects. But yeah, I mean, he had the experience of working under all these directors, even under the drama side, not just as part of the tokusatsu staff. But to return to that, so he graduated in 1959, and he wanted to join a studio. And according to his biography, he didn't really have a preference for which studio it was. It just so happened at the time that Toho was recruiting, but they had a letter of recommendation system. So you had to get a letter of recommendation from a Toho employee saying, this person would be a good hire. And so he happened to have a neighbor who was a Toho employee in one of the, again, maybe it was the sales department, I forget what it was, but it wasn't a very high-ranking person in any case. So he applied to Toho, and he applied to take the entrance exam. And so he didn't remember exactly what he had to do for the entrance exam, but he recalls that he probably had to write an essay about a social issue. Why that is, I don't know. I mean, again, it is kind of a strange thing. But that was what you had to do back then. If you wanted to join, especially as an assistant director, you had to take the entrance exam. And according to his memory, maybe about 1,000 people took the exam. And then, of course, out of that 1,000, who knows how many were chosen, but it was going to be it's a very small number. And I've interviewed other assistant directors, or people who went on to be assistant directors, and they all tell the same thing. Like I interviewed a person who worked at Nikatsu, who joined Nikatsu in the late 50s, and his story was exactly the same. He passed the entrance exam, maybe about 1,000 people took it, and maybe like a handful of them actually were able to pass. So that wasn't. So again, he was very lucky to get hired at Toho at the time, and it was a busy time. Like I said, the 50s were really the peak of that production era, and he was working on maybe about 7 or 8 movies per month, in the early days. So it was just a very busy time, and being a new hire, obviously he was like the lowest man on the hierarchy, so he wasn't going to have a lot of input. He was just there to kind of make sure that things were carried out as an assistant director, but he did quickly move up the ranks. Now, in terms of his work as an assistant director, Mr. Nakano recalled that he was very open with his opinions, which is not always the most common thing, especially in a hierarchical society like Japan. Usually the junior members are going to be very deferential to the senior members. But according to Mr. Nakano, he was very open with his opinions and kind of said what he felt. So again, a very unusual quality to have. Now, talking about his jump over to tokusatsu, I don't know if you've read it. I don't know what you've heard, but I've heard the story that for the octopus scene, that only 4 octopuses were used. I don't know if you've come across that number or not in your research. Have you?
No, I have not. So this should be interesting, actually.
Because in the interview that I did with him in 2004, and again, as I said, the translation might be a little iffy, so I'm not sure how much I can trust that. Mr. Nakano said 50 octopuses were used.
Really? 50?
Yes.
0.
50. And in later years, because later on I would discover that like Wikipedia and other sites would say 4. So I made sure to ask him again, and how many octopuses were used? And over the years, he would tell me like about 30, maybe 20 to 30. Like at different times, like the number would fluctuate a little bit, but it wasn't 4. It was 20 to 30, or I don't know if the 50 number, if that was just a mistranslation, or I don't know honestly, but obviously well more than 4. And he said that obviously the famous story that I think we've all heard is that after the shoot, Mr. Tsuburaya himself would have the octopus for lunch or whatever it was.
Yeah.
Well, according to Mr. Nakano, it was the whole staff who ate octopus afterwards.
Because there's enough to go around, right?
Exactly. And he even kind of joked that he still hated octopuses because he had to eat so many of them during that time.
Oh, that's incredible. I picture a big tank of them, off to the side, and it's like, oh, we need another one.
Yeah, and according to the interview, he said that it was just hard to get the octopuses to act. They didn't want to act. They're not trained actors. So, they wanted certain movements from the octopuses. They wanted it to move, and it just wouldn't move. So, like, okay, let's get another one. Maybe this one will be a little bit better. Okay, that didn't work. Get another one. Like, it was, from what I understand, it was done basically like that. So that's essentially the story that he told. And another tidbit, you may have heard this. You may have heard that both Mr. Nakano and Mr. Nakajima, in separate interviews, have taken credit for the idea that when Godzilla comes out of the ground in Mothra versus Godzilla, Godzilla kind of shakes the dirt off. Have you heard that before?
I have heard that, and I've of course heard that it was Mr. Nakajima's idea widely. And I mean, I guess I have no reason to disbelieve it, but I'm interested in what Mr. Nakano had on that.
Well, the interesting thing is that it's not what Mr. Nakano said, but it's what a third party said. So I'll get to that in a moment. But I just wanted to point out that as someone who's done countless interviews, and there are over 200 interviews on my website, by the way, it's a lot. One of the frustrating things is I want to drill down on what really happened. And after a while, you realize that people remember things very differently. There's a couple of stories I could go into that have nothing to do with Mr. Nakano or anything, in terms of just how people could possibly remember things so vastly differently. And as someone who obviously wasn't there, wasn't even born yet, how can I referee that? How can I be the arbiter and say what really happened or what really didn't happen? So you're just kind of stuck going, well, I don't know. Yeah. And that's the frustrating thing is, as much as I love doing interviews and I love doing them, it is frustrating because in terms of drilling down on those little details and in terms of getting 100% what really happened, oftentimes you'll never get there. People misremember things, people disagree, memories fade, people hold back on the truth for whatever reason. Maybe they don't want to hurt someone's feelings, or especially in Japan. I mean, that's true. People are not as open about the past as they are in the US for a variety of reasons. But anyway, I had an occasion to interview, I shouldn't say interview, but over a couple of, at a couple of events, I did have the opportunity to throw a few questions at a woman named Keiko Suzuki, who was Mr. Tsuburaya's script supervisor on the tokusatsu side, who worked on, basically throughout the 60s, she worked on all the tokusatsu films. So I asked her to kind of referee that. I said, well, Mr. Nakano has said one thing, Mr. Nakajima has said the other thing. What do you think really happened? And in her opinion, she said that it was probably Mr. Nakano who suggested that, simply because as a suit actor, suit actors wouldn't have made those suggestions. That would probably more likely come from the man who was chief assistant director at the time. And I did mention to her, well, Mr. Nakajima has also said that he was given the freedom to choreograph monster fights. So wouldn't that have, and, her response was like, oh, yes, he did have the freedom to do that. But, in terms of things not related to monster fight choreography, that would most likely come from the tokusatsu directors, whether, again, chief assistant director or the director himself. So in terms of that third party, who, again, I should point out, doesn't necessarily have specific firsthand memory of what happened there. That's just her interpretation based on what I presented to her of what probably happened. So perhaps Mr. Nakajima is telling the truth. Maybe he misremembers something. I don't know. But again, it's just one of those things where they both can't be right. But, who are we to referee that? Who are we to make the final decision about that?
No, and that makes sense. But you're also thinking, maybe even logically, the suit actor cannot feel the dirt. So maybe it would be someone on the outside of the suit who has that visual idea of what it looks like on film. who would make a suggestion like that. So there's another reason to believe the other side of the story, because obviously he's seeing it. So maybe, oh wait, maybe you should shake that dirt off, because that would kind of make sense, because the next scene we're going to see him not covered in so much of that dirt. So that would make sense from a visual standpoint, because again, the suit actor can't see all that on him and he can't feel it. Maybe he feels the extra weight of it, but doubtful. So but you're right, memory, it's interesting when two people who have shared the same experiences have said, well, I think the car was blue, I think the car was green, and then until you see a photograph of it to disprove it, that's pretty absolute. But when it comes to someone's thoughts, someone's suggestion, someone's idea, that's all in here. Unless again we were there to experience it and hear the conversations, who knows? Until we'd actually see maybe film evidence of it, it is all to the annals of history, right?
You said it very well. And there's another. I won't get into it because it has nothing to do with Mr. Nakano. But you talked about colors. Perfect example. Toho, King Ghidorah. What was King Ghidorah's original color? Well, if you ask Keizo Murase, who painted the suit, he'll say one thing, and if you talk to Keiko Suzuki, who again was the tokusatsu script supervisor, she'll tell you another thing. And they vastly disagree. They have completely different memories. There's no way to make their memories match. But they have vastly different memories, and they totally disagree with one another. So again, who am I to go in there and say who's right or who's wrong? All I can do is present their testimony, and I would say leave it up to the audience, leave it up to the reader, but I don't even think the reader is in any position to make a decision, because I know I can't. I'm in no position to make a decision. So I don't think anyone is, and it's just one of those things where, it's lost to history, like you said. But I will mention another situation more involving Mr. Nakano, because there is he later took over gunpowder effects during Mr. Nakano's time as a special effects director. His name is Tadaki Watanabe. And he was on the tokusatsu crew during the time of Destroy All Monsters. And there is a production photo of Mr. Watanabe in the Angula suit on set. And of course, if you think about it, obviously there's so many suit actors needed. It would make logical sense that, hey, the main Angula suit actor is, in this other suit, maybe Gorosaurus. So why don't you come here, Mr. Watanabe, get in the suit for this scene, and we'll just do the shot. And that was Mr. Watanabe's testimony, is that he was Angulus in some shots. Well, he passed away last year, and I was at an event with Mr. Nakano, and I was telling people, well, that Mr. Watanabe was in Angulus, right? He was in the Angulus suit. Oh, I don't know that. What are you talking about? And I showed him the photo, because I have a photo of him where I met him in 2015, and it's a photo of him holding up like a printout of, and you can go to my blog, sidelong glances of the pigeonkicker.blogspot.com. It's a lot of work. Or you can go on Wikizilla, and you can type in Tadaki, Tadaaki Watanabe. Wikizilla uses my photo in his biography, so you can go there if you want. Look at it. But it's him holding a picture of him in the Angula suit. I mean, he's in the suit. I mean, there's proof of it.
Yeah, photographic proof. Yeah.
Photographic proof. And so we showed it to Mr. Nakano, who was at that event. And we were like, hey, did you know that he was in, because, and he said, oh, no, he would not have been in the movie. He would not have been a suit actor in the movie. Why not? Because he wasn't a professional suit actor, and we did not use people who were not professional suit actors in the suit. So maybe he was in there for a camera test. Maybe he was in there for, something like that, but he would not have been in the film as a suit actor. That was Mr. Nakano's testimony. And he's chief assistant director, during this time. So again, what can anyone do? Like, what are we supposed to make of that? Why would he be in the suit? And I don't know. I mean, again, what are we supposed to make of this?
No, I get it. Yeah, because it's like You know, to take an American example of the Predator suit and the actor, you know, his name escapes me, but the photographic evidence that we also know that Jean-Claude Van Damme, before he became the Jean-Claude Van Damme we know, was in the suit for an amount of time. There is photographic evidence of it, but yeah, how much of that did end up on film, which is, I guess, Mr. Nakano's point, is that maybe it was for something that was done just so they could get a camera test, get a light check, a color check, or whatever. I guess that's possible, but at least the suit was being put on, and I don't know, maybe it was just honorable, or maybe it was just something to do to put it on. But I doubt that he would have done it just for the memory of it, because of the arduous task of wearing those heavy suits. So. But yeah, what ended up on film, you know, I guess it would come down to someone in the effects department to be able to tell, yeah, okay, I remember that shot, and he is in that suit, or he is not in that suit.
Yeah, and I think, you know, maybe by and large, you know, Mr. Nakano is correct that they didn't use people who were not professional suit actors. But again, if you think about this production, there were so many suit actors needed. I mean, you know, it stands to reason in my mind that maybe in a scene where, you know, Angulas didn't have to do a lot, he just needed to stand in the background. What would be the harm in getting a volunteer from the tokusatsu crew to just stand in the suit for a few moments where he doesn't really have, he's not fighting, you know, he's not really the center of the action, he's just in the background. Like, what would be, why is that impossible? I don't understand that. But again, I'm using this example to point out that memories differ, and they can have very good reasons for their differing memories, to the point where it just makes it impossible for us to get to the bottom of that and come to a definitive answer. We have our opinions, but in that situation, it's like, you know, because for years I always thought undoubtedly, you know, Mr. Watanabe was in the Angular suit for some of the scenes. And again, he never said, oh, I was the main suit actor. It was always, yes, I was in like a fill-in, you know, with the main suit actor, probably Sekida, you know, Hiroshi Sekida was, you know, probably playing Gorosaurus or something like that. You know, so I always thought, you know, unquestionably, and there's photographic proof, and they would not, you know, they would not have been joking around putting on the suits for fun, because it was on the set. You know, there's limited budgets, limited time. They got a job to do, so they're not putting on suits, joking around, taking photographs for fun. You know, but again, it's like, but what's the point of getting in for a light check, for a camera test? Why not use the regular suit actor that you're going to use anyway? I don't know. Anyway, I'm just pointing out this is another example, and it has to do with Mr. Nakano, why it's so difficult to drill down on these details.
Well, and I guess to maybe add a defense to how memory is like that, and how memory can be shaped by the experiences of during the time where you're being questioned, where you're sat down during an interview, is it maybe someone's impression of someone else? And I might, you know, ask you, how he regarded Mr. Tsuburaya working under him. You know, I could maybe make an assumption later in his life he would not want to dishonor maybe the name of Tsuburaya, but also understanding that on set these two men are working, and budgets and timelines, deadlines can get two people, I don't care how kind they can be to one another, that they could get each other really angered and riled up, and you know, in each other's faces, and it can be even knocked down, drag out. So you know, someone's maybe a long-term memory and overall memory of someone. So did he have those kinds of discussions about Mr. Tsuburaya, working with him, his regards for how he was working with him?
Of course. I mean, you know, he had a lot to say, and, you know, everyone's memory, if you talk to anyone who worked with Tsuburaya for the most part, will talk about, you know, Mr. Tsuburaya as a father figure. And, you know, I'll kind of get into a little bit more detail about what I mean when I say a father figure. But in my notes, I don't really have any specific stories about that. I wish I could have that material for you. But like, I focused a lot in terms of like personal stories that I told. And sometimes, you know, you have a chance to ask about what Mr. Nakano did directly, rather than, you know, what Mr. Tsuburaya may have taught him. So again, I mean, I really wanted to have that like final interview with him to, you know, drill down on what Mr. Tsuburaya taught him, and and get those kinds of stories. And, but I just never got that chance. And I really wish I did, because with Mr. Nakano, again, there's just so many, there's decades to cover, and it's hard to get to everything that you want to cover. But I do have this to say. I think maybe the best example of his working relationship with Mr. Tsuburaya, if you go to An Explosive Career, and if you look up his story about Atragon, because Atragon, I didn't have it in my notes, and I'm kind of surprised when I went back and looked for it. I didn't write it down, but I do remember asking Mr. Nakano not that long ago, what was the most difficult film you worked on? And he said, Atragon. And if you go to An Explosive Career on VantagePointInterviews.com, he talks about why Atragon was such a difficult movie. And it was basically if I remember the details, I hope I do, but Mr. Tsuburaya came to him and said, we don't have much time to do this. We have very limited time, but we got to get it out. And so they had to divide up the workload. And it was like, for him, I think it was like, again, it was just like, it was, how can I describe it? It almost like an initiation, perhaps. Like it was trial by fire for sure. I mean, you'd have to. I don't have it here in my notes, so I don't want to like quote too much, because it would all be from memory, and my worry is I would misquote it a little bit too much. But it was just like, if you go back, it was a real trial by fire, and like it was like Mr. Tsuburaya coming to him and saying, "We got to do this. Like, time is running out. We got to figure out a way to do this." And they did it. It was successful. And I think there were some tears involved when it was all said and done. So like in terms of having a story as it relates to Mr. Tsuburaya working with Mr. Nakano, that's what I would, encourage anyone to go read. I don't have anything in my notes, unfortunately. I've got a lot of other stuff in my notes, but that unfortunately is not what I have.
Yeah, I was bringing up okay, this is the memories of the Mechagodzilla SFX Teruyoshi Nakano, that on the website. So I'll have to search around again to look, on the Explosive Career. But yeah, that's definitely something I want everyone to look at on their own. I would rather point people towards the website and get some of your impressions like you've just done for us, and even anecdotal stories like that. I find is really revealing and puts you into that time period. Like you said, both of us weren't alive during those times where Mr. Tsuburaya was working with Mr. Nakano, and then Ishiro Honda and all of them, the heyday of tokusatsu. And so these anecdotal stories, be that what they are, it does put us in those places to relive that story. I've always said, and I know it will never get made, but if someone's listening and has a couple $1 million to spend, I would love to see the dramatization film of the early days of tokusatsu, beginning with Godzilla and moving forward with Ishiro Honda, seeing him working with Akira Fukube and Haru Nakajima and all of the Eiji Tsuburaya, and seeing how the impossible task of bringing this creature to life and this realistic look of the 1950s through 1970s and the 80s and 90s even, how that began and what kind of legacy it left. To see, even if it were just to say the original 54 Godzilla, and seeing a Hollywood dramatization of this, obviously with some embellishment, because that's what a lot of these stories are. Sometimes you probably found in your interviews the embellishment of some of those stories, of making it even bigger than it really probably was. But I'll say this much: Mr. Nakano knew his explosions. So if he were asked to do the explosions, he gave you that and then some, even to the point of setting the Godzilla suit on fire, right?
Well, and not only that, but there was the situation where you might have heard that during the filming of Last Days of Planet Earth, also known as Prophecies of Nostradamus, you may have heard, and please tell me if you have, that one of the studios at Toho burned down.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Did you hear about that story?
I have heard that. And is it the shot? Is it a particular shot that was reused in '84? If I'm not mistaken.
No, and actually, you talk about embellishments, and I think this is one of the stories that gets embellished a lot, not necessarily by the people who were there, but by people who talk about this, or they heard that, oh, a studio burned down, and that type of a thing. Let me, oh boy, where is this?
Because I know some of the shots were farmed out. Special effects shots were farmed out from other films for like explosion scenes in '84. Specifically, I think the highway scene, for instance. But
stock footage, yeah,
stock footage, yeah. But was it that that created? It was not that. Okay, impressive regardless. But
well, there's I have another interview in the pipeline coming out that I hope will come out in a couple of months probably. That talks a little bit more about the aftermath of what happened. I do have an interview on my site right now with a man named Takashi Naganuma, who was a model maker, started in the 1970s, worked on Last Days of Planet Earth, and I believe he worked on it, yeah. But anyway, he told the story, and Mr. Nakano's story in his autobiography, as well as the story that Mr. Naganuma told me on my website, is basically the same. It happened during lunchtime. That's the most important thing. Because when you hear the story told by fans, it usually makes it sound like Nakano was like, okay, action, boom, and then everything burned down. And that's not what happened. It happened during lunchtime. So basically, what Mr. Naganuma said is that it was a scene of a dried out lake bed that was under intense heat. And both sides agree that it was in Studio 7, which was built in 1935, at the time that talkies, talking motion pictures, not silent films, started to become the norm in Japan. So in order to soundproof the studios, inside the walls were things like straw, very flammable.
Right.
So under this intense heat, the straw inside the studio went up.
Wow.
And the whole Studio 7, burned down. And it happened during lunchtime. So it wasn't, they loaded something up with gunpowder, ready, action, boom. No, it wasn't that. It's the reality of the situation is much more mundane. It was a total accident. It was just that you had an ancient, 1930s era studio filled with straw that had never been updated in all those years. A real fire hazard. It finally just went up.
It's, if anything, it was an accident waiting to happen. And maybe, I guess, during the fact that it was lunchtime and people weren't tied down in the studio under cameras and under lights and locked down in the dark, injuries, casualties, anything from that you've heard about?
No casualties. I mean, again, shooting wasn't going on at the time. So,
right.
And there is some aftermath, which is interesting, but I'll save that for when the interview comes out. I don't want to scoop myself. But I will say this, that the next tokusatsu film was S-Spy, or ESP Spy, came out in late '74. And that's a big, fairly big budget, all-star cast movie. And the ending of that movie ends with the house where the bad guy is, it blows up. And according to Mr. Nakano, that was the last big explosion that he was allowed to do at Toho. So after that, it was like, we got to kind of clamp down on fire hazards and things like that. So there was backlash. There was a reaction to that. And so that, according to Mr. Nakano, was the last big explosion he was able to do after that.
Okay. Everything else was just a little bit more tamped down and controlled, or outside, maybe. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, it was just, they had to take more precautions. I mean, obviously, if you look at a movie like Conflagration or Tokyo Bay Burns from 1975, there's a lot of fire in that as well. But presumably, that was a much more controlled situation, or at least not as big as some of these other explosions. But according to him, according to what he said, that was the last big explosion he was able to do at Toho. So, so let's continue on. We've got Smog Monster next to talk about.
Ah, excellent.
So, according to Mr. Bono, and as I said, I have this document that Mr. Banno was preparing for his autobiography, written in both Japanese and English. And also there's an interview on my website with Mr. Banno where he talks about these things as well. This was the first time, because usually, certainly in the days of Mr. Tsuburaya and even Sadamasa Arikawa and the other special effects directors, they had the two separate units. You had the drama side and the tokusatsu side. Well, because the budget was very limited for this film, everything was sort of consolidated into one team. So, you had Banno is the A camera, basically. Mr. Nakano is the B camera. And according to Mr. Banno, he said that Tomoyuki Tanaka, the big Toho producer, told him that Mr. Tsuburaya is the only special effects director, so Mr. Nakano is the technical assistant. But he is not special effects director, that's only Mr. Tsuburaya. So Banno was basically in charge of both. And, again, Nakano was the technical assistant, but ultimately it was Banno overseeing one staff doing both sides. So when you look at pictures of Smog Monster, the special effects side, you see Banno much more involved in the special effects side than you would see Jun Fukuda or Ishiro Honda, because there was more of a separation, during those days. But here you see Banno everywhere, like he's in all the special effects shots, and that's because, he's, manning both sides basically. Mr. Nakano was there, but again, as the technical assistant. And it was a very quick shoot. And according to Mr. Banno, let's see here. So he said that both the drama and special effects sides were shot in parallel for about a period of 2 to 2.5 months. And this was done in an attempt to reduce the budget and to, get things done more quickly with a single crew. Now, the interesting thing is that at one point, like during their most successful shooting schedule, they could do as many as 50 shots in one day, which is an amazing thing. I mean, if you could do 50 shots in one day for any movie, that's really kind of insane. But they did it. And however, for some of the more technical shots involving things like composite photography, when Godzilla and Hedorah are fighting at the foot of Mount Fuji, he said that for those shots, they'd only get maybe like about 3 in a day. So, I mean, you can see for those more, technical shots, it would take a lot more time to get those right than the other shots where they were getting like, as many as 50 shots a day.
And I was going to maybe explain to those who might be saying, composite shots, what are you talking about? And how I would say shots where you have your people in the foreground who are watching this happen in the background, who actually have, that I always look at that movie kind of like drive-in theater. Everyone's hanging out. It's at night. The monsters are really well lit, actually, for being night, but, they get their front row seats to this monster action that's happening. But yeah, to composite, the human being shots and having that in the background and combining 2 shots to make that happen was something that Toho, I really found, did really well, especially, starting from the original Gojira, where you had even some American films where those composite shots would have that shake effect where they would bounce and you could tell where the seams of the 2 shots were. And so that is impressive even to this day, seeing it on HD quality that we have now of Smog Monster, being able to see those composite shots and how well they did. So obviously those take more time, and so you're saying that they would probably do maybe a couple of those a day.
Yeah, that's according to Mr. Banno. And Koichi Kawakita would be involved in a lot of those composite shots. Like that was kind of his forte at the time. He was working behind the scenes in that way during that time. So a lot of that, especially for Smog Monster, was his work. And so another issue about Smog Monster, and again, I've talked about this, on my blog, in the past couple of months. But there is the account of, did Mr. Tanaka say that Yoshimitsu Banno ruined Godzilla? That's the story that gets bandied about a lot. I'm sure you've heard that.
Definitely heard that, yes.
I think we all have. And I don't know. I mean, I'll say this. I knew Mr. Bano for many years, and he always told the story consistently. He was never told that he ruined Godzilla. He was told, and I think this is an exact quote, "It is not good to change the character of Godzilla." And I've heard that, and again, like I went back and I looked at this document. In the immediate aftermath, Mr. Tanaka started a company. He was like a planning company with investment from like Mitsubishi and other major corporations. And this is at the time that Toho started to kind of, I guess, diversify, and they were getting more involved in like the expos that were going on, like Expo 70, Expo 75, both of which were in Japan, theme parks, which, Mr. Nakano also worked on much later in his career after he, retired from special effects. And Mr. Tanaka wanted to recruit Mr. Bano to join this company. But Mr. Bano said, "No, thank you. You made me a director. I want to stay a director." And that's where he wanted to pursue his career. Later on, and by the end of the 70s, Mr. Bano was working in the Toho planning department, which is, that's basically it's, producing movies. He became a producer basically. So the idea that, he ruined Godzilla and Mr. Tanaka prevented him from ever directing the movie again is pretty silly given the evidence. I've heard somebody say, I'm not going to name his name, but I've heard somebody say that he has a videotape of Mr. Bano saying this in English. But I find it highly doubtful because Mr. Bano has spoken about it, written about it, you name it, and it's always told the same way. But again, how can I referee this? Well, it was actually the last time I saw Mr. Nakano was on his birthday last year, October 9th. And I had occasion to ask him, because I did hear somebody say that, like, it was a comment on a message board. "Oh, I heard Mr. Nakano, support that. Oh yeah, Tanaka said that he ruined Godzilla." So I asked him, and I gave him both sides. I explained both situations. I told him the story that Bano has consistently told over the years, and I told him the other version that he ruined Godzilla. And after hearing both sides, Mr. Nakano said, "I think Mr. Bano's side is probably right. That was his understanding too." And then he went on to suggest that, yeah, maybe some of these newspapers and stuff, they can exaggerate things for, dramatic effect. But he basically sided with Mr. Bano in saying that it wasn't like a reaction of like, "Oh, you ruined Godzilla." It was just more like, it's not good to change the character of Godzilla.
And maybe it was as innocent as that, and like we've talked about, embellishing over history. Obviously, if maybe creative differences were there, I kind of look at it this way: sometimes to get someone out of the creative side of things, they kind of promote them to something else to get them out of the creative side of things. And so it's like, I wasn't like Tanaka wasn't as involved, I know, in Smog Monster. I think what was it, due to illness or scheduling or illness? I think, wasn't it?
He was in the hospital. Yeah.
Yeah. So he may not have had so much of the day to day, and so I guess in a sense that Bano got away with things is maybe the way to say it. But at the same time, the film didn't end Godzilla, and Mr. Bano, if you were to say he failed upwards, and he became the producer, and eventually we got our legendary Godzilla because he was the executive producer of those films, to bringing the rights over to the United States. But that is interesting that you go from the creative side to the more executive side of things, and we didn't lose Godzilla as a result of that. So maybe he found his calling in that.
Well, in the planning department, don't forget, that's where ideas come from. That's where, like it's not just like, you're a bean counter or something like that. You are planning movies. You're planning projects, like you're getting things off the ground. So there is in a sense, there is a creative aspect to it. So I just want to be clear about that. I understand your point. I see what you're saying, that like, maybe it was, because after that, again, Tanaka is saying like, "Hey, why don't you join this other company?" Could that be a way to get him out? Possibly. Again, all the parties are dead now, so we'll never know for sure. But I do want to, we'll put a bow on that, because I do want to come back to something that happened on a movie 2 years later that will call into question any idea about ruining Godzilla. And we'll get to that in a moment. But I do want to talk about a little bit about the differences between the directors, because that was one of the things that I know in our discussions we were talking about. You wanted to drill down on that. Well, in terms of Mr. Tsuburaya wanted to keep things very family friendly. And in one of the interviews I did with Mr. Nakajima, which is again on my website, he mentioned, Mr. Nakajima mentioned that there was a memory of, some of the staff wanted to maybe show some blood in some of the monster fights. And Mr. Tsuburaya actually kind of like snapped back at that idea, and he said, do you think it's a good idea to show blood to children? So, he took it very seriously, and like that was just a non-starter. Obviously, we started to see that with Mr. Nakano, who wanted to show more, get more sympathy on the good guys by showing blood, and was it too much? Maybe. I mean, I don't know, but that was his idea. That's one difference between the two. And as I said before, a little bit earlier, Mr. Tsuburaya was a father figure, and he was a matchmaker. Did I mention that before, that he was a matchmaker for his staff members?
That's news to me. No, a matchmaker.
He got his staff members married to each other. And, like Sadao Iizuka, who was the Ray animator for Godzilla, starting from King Kong versus Godzilla and throughout the 60s. I have an interview with him where he talks about how Mr. Tsuburaya got him to marry, one of his animating assistants, because they would have women come from Tama Art University and work as assistants in the art department. And so these were young college grads, and you had a lot of young guys in the tokusatsu crew. So Mr. Tsuburaya would say, hey, why don't you two get married? And Mr. Iizuka was like, oh, I don't want to marry her. There's somebody else I want to marry. But he got married. There's another situation where Keiko Suzuki, she got the name Suzuki by marrying Kiyoshi Suzuki, who was working at Toho at the time in the early 60s. Mr. Suzuki went on to work at Tsuburaya Productions and became a big producer. Well, they got married at Toho thanks to Tsuburaya, according to what Mr. Kiyoshi Suzuki told me. And so, yeah, so like he would play matchmaker. Like he was very much a father figure. And when you talk to people who knew Tsuburaya and worked under him, like that was what comes through, is he was a father figure. It wasn't just that they respected him as, a creative person. He was a father figure and was involved in their lives in ways that just didn't exist after him.
And culturally, I've heard this too, where the elders highly regarded in the sense that when they make suggestions or even arrangements for relationships, it's taken very seriously. And arranged marriages weren't maybe as I don't know. Today it's probably taboo, but through the 50s, 60s, 70s, I imagine maybe it started to wane, but it was not unheard of for these kind of arranged marriages to happen. But then again, the respect for the elders, they've been there, they've done that, they've made the mistakes, and they're trying to give you their advice to let you know, no, this actually is good advice. You really should be encouraged in this direction to marry someone. So that is interesting that father figure is not just in a mentorship way, but intimately involved in their lives.
I mean, that's the thing to remember is he had that level of respect, and it's really amazing. And again, I don't think anyone was pressured to do anything they didn't want to do. I mean, Japan is a very different culture from America. So we have to bear that in mind. And of course, back then it was also a different time from the way it is now. Japan is still traditional, but it is changing in ways, that are certainly different from the way things were done back then. But yeah, Mr. Iizuka said very openly that like he was kind of fighting against it. He didn't want to marry this woman. He was more interested in somebody else that he had his eye on. But ultimately, he went with it, and they were married. And Mr. Tsuburaya presided over the wedding. I mean, it's
wow.
Yeah. Again, it's you didn't have that later on. Now, in terms of Mr. Nakano and Mr. Kawakita. Mr. Nakano was much more of a traditional person, very orthodox, traditional tokusatsu style. Mr. Kawakita was more innovative. I mean, when you look at the scenes in Sayonara Jupiter, for example, I mean, Mr. Kawakita was trying to use new technology and new techniques. I mean, it's one of the reasons that the special effects in that film, people often compare them to what was going on in Hollywood at the time and saying that it's about equal. So, I mean, when you think about it that way, I mean, you really have to give credit to Mr. Kawakita for being very innovative and being very, just creative and so forth. But here's another difference between Mr. Kawakita and Mr. Nakano. Mr. Nakano is very calm. He's very kind. I've never heard anyone, except maybe one person, which I'll talk about that, say anything bad about Mr. Nakano. But I have heard people who work under Mr. Kawakita say that he could be short-tempered. I had one staff member say to me in an interview that's not yet published, but I think will be published soon, I just didn't like him. I didn't get along with him because he could be short-tempered, and he could be a little bit demanding. I did hear one person, Daisaku Kimura, who was a cinematographer and didn't think of himself as a tokusatsu person because he worked under Kurosawa. He worked on a lot of big movies. He shot Submersion of Japan. Mr. Nakano's, the big special effects thing. And at an event I attended, Mr. Kimura said, "Oh, I don't like Nakano," and didn't explain why. Probably it had nothing to do with the personality clash. It probably just had to do with the fact that maybe he sort of sees himself above tokusatsu, I guess. Which whatever, fair enough. But yeah, that's But in terms of Kawakita and Mr. Nakano, that I think would be the big difference between them is Mr. Kawakita. Sometimes he, wasn't always the easiest person to work with. But Mr. Nakano, I've never heard anyone other than that say anything negative about him. Very easygoing, very friendly, and not strict or demanding.
And I guess maybe what you were referring to is being Nakano as very traditional. You would say that Kawakita, non-traditional, experimental in his techniques, I would say.
Yes, and he also came from another point that somebody made when I interviewed him, is that Mr. Kawakita, he did a lot of composite photography. So he wasn't in the field in the way that Mr. Nakano was for all those years. So I think maybe Mr. Nakano built up relationships and built up a reputation. So even though Mr. Kawakita did work as an assistant special effects director on things like Godzilla versus Mechagodzilla and so forth, he was sort of behind the scenes, doing composite work. And so somebody suggested to me that could explain why, the relationship was a bit different between Mr. Nakano and Mr. Kawakita. Mr. Nakano was in the field doing the work. Maybe Mr. Kawakita wasn't so much. And so that could explain the different dynamic as well.
I see. And so, and Mr. Kawakita is another, someone maybe we'll speak about in a few that we've lost, not so recently, but decently recently, I'd say in the last decade that we've lost, and someone, maybe we can speak about just briefly. And I also want to make sure that, you've been very generous with your time. So if you need to signal to me that we need to start bringing this in for a landing, maybe we'll have a part 2 sometime, because, you and I could probably talk about this for hours and hours and hours. And I think we've left our audience spellbound. I haven't gotten any questions in the comments, but this is also going to be on replay for people to see as well. But was there more on Mr. Nakano? I think there was an Easter egg or maybe a little teaser you were going to bring out about another film earlier, or was that about the violence?
Oh, okay, I got it.
Okay.
We'll get there. There's a lot to unpack, and I'm good until about let's say 5 minutes before the hour.
Okay.
So we've still got some time, but I still got a lot of notes here. So
I understand. So, and like I said, you've been very generous, and I really appreciate it. Thank you. You're a wealth of knowledge, and I knew that this interview, this discussion, this was going to be a good one, because I love talking about this. I mean, we could talk about toys, and I love toys, but there's a lot of content creation about toys. I want to hear about the history. I want to hear these stories, and you're a wealth of knowledge when it comes to the stories, especially through your experiences and interactions with them. So I envy that about you, and that's why I appreciate bringing you on here, because you can bring it to me and the audience, but selfishly me.
Well, thank you. I do appreciate your comments. It's very kind of you. And I do the best that I can. I'm not perfect. I'm sure I've made mistakes. I just want to clarify that because I know a lot of people, they hang their reputation on I'm never wrong. I know everything. I'm a one-stop shop. And I'm very free in admitting that I'm not. And I've told you specifically when there are things I don't know, I'll tell you I don't know. And those 3 words are deadly to some other people in this fandom. So I just want to be clear that yes, I have researched things and I've done my best, but I'm human and humans make mistakes. So I'll be very frank with you about that. So I just want to be clear about that. I appreciate your comments, but let's also be realistic that I'm a human and mistakes happen. So let's just be clear about that.
I get it.
Okay, so anyway, but let's continue. So in terms of gunpowder and explosions, and I actually found this interesting because I didn't know this until I was doing research. In Mr. Nakano's autobiography, he credits someone named Kyuzo Yamamoto, who was a longtime props person at Toho, whose career I think goes back to Godzilla 1954 and all the way through the 70s and so forth. As the man who kind of turned him on to gunpowder effects. And apparently he was a very creative person and liked to experiment with different things. But he credits Mr. Yamamoto as sort of the guy, who sort of exposed him to the idea of using gunpowder effects. So that's where that came from, if anyone wanted to know. It's apparently Kyuzo Yamamoto, whose name I didn't even know until I researched it. So there you go. And okay, so you wanted to talk about that movie and that movie story about ruining Godzilla. We talked about Mr. Banno. Well, it's actually, I guess it's not that very well known in fandom, but I have an interview on my website that's been out there for about a year where this situation is talked about. Eiji Tsuburayas, who went on to be the special effects director for Tokyo SOS and Final Wars, got his start in the early 70s as an assistant director on Godzilla vs. Megalon. And he told the story about how Mr. Fukuda and Mr. Nakano got together and they decided to have some fun with the movie in a way that Mr. Tanaka really did not appreciate. You may have seen the still photo of Godzilla with the telephone pole in his mouth.
Yes.
And he's also holding a tree. Well, the telephone pole is based on a character called Kogarashi Monjiro. And that was a TV show based on a book and whatever. But at the time, it was a big hit TV show with a character who was in Edo era Tokyo. And so it was a period piece. And he had straw that was in his mouth. And the sword was based on Zatoichi. So what they decided to do was they were going to have a lot of fun. And Godzilla was going to impersonate Kogarashi Monjiro and Zatoichi in his battle with the monsters. And this is all on my website. This is not a big secret. It's been out there. And Tanaka was, I don't know, furious. I don't know if that's the word. But he said, this is not going to work. You guys need to film this stuff all over again without the goofy stuff. And going back to Banno said this about Tanaka. Tanaka said, if you want to add more, we can add more. But retakes, doing things over again, no, that's a waste. I'm not interested in retakes. If you want to add more, that's okay. But no retakes. They had to retake this.
The one time.
Yeah, and Mr. Fukuda actually showed up to the tokusatsu stage personally to apologize to the crew and said, this is my fault. I'm very sorry to everybody. This is why we're doing it. It's my fault.
See, so, but unheard of, unprecedented in that. But, the tribute, yeah, we've seen that. There's even been models made of that very scene and a lot of publicity stills of that, but it's not in the film, of course. So I always wondered, where did that come from? That whole idea. So it is a tribute, and someone in immersed in Japanese culture would see that kind of like, the Godzilla invasion of Astro Monster, the Shay or She dance, us, Americans would not understand that. To us, it's just a goofy dance, but there is a reference to that in Japanese culture, and so that's interesting. That story, I will have to look up that interview, and then that story on Vantage Point Interviews there to see more of that. But yeah, I love that still of that. But yeah, it's not in the movie.
Exactly. And yeah, I've seen that over the years too, and I never knew what that was about until Mr. Osada, told me about that. So yeah, and that's where it comes from, and that's his memory of it. So again, if Mr. Fukuda was invited to direct the next Godzilla film after that, and that's after they had to reshoot something, which again, Banno specifically remembered that Tanaka said, don't reshoot anything, but if you want to add more, that's okay because that's adding to it. But just doing the same thing over again, that's a waste. I'm not interested in that. But he made them, reshoot that because he wasn't satisfied. It was too goofy. It was getting too far away from, what needed to be done. So next he did Submersion of Japan, which of course is, a lot of people say that's his masterpiece. It's a very big budget movie with like an all-star cast. And when talking about being promoted, and this is the first time he was actually credited as special effects director. So I mentioned before that, Banno said he was technical assistant. He wasn't given that title of special effects director until Submersion of Japan. And Mr. Nakano, though, said that he, didn't really have much of a reaction to it. Like, it wasn't a big deal for him to get that title. I guess the work was still the same. Nothing really changed for him. So he didn't have a very strong reaction to that when he was promoted. He did tell a story once. Sakyo Komatsu, who's kind of considered the Arthur C. Clarke of Japan, and his novel is the basis of Submersion of Japan. He also wrote the novels based on S-Spy, which I mentioned earlier, and Virus, the all-star cast with American and Western actors, and Sayonara Jupiter. But Mr. Komatsu loved the actress named Kaoru Yumi, and he really wanted her to be the love interest in this film. But it turned out to be Ai Ishida instead. But he got her in the TV version of Submersion of Japan that came out. So that was another story that Mr. Nakano told.
If I could just ask a quick, just to make sure I heard you right, his accreditation of special effects director was prevented in a sense. Was it by Banno or was it by Tanaka?
Tanaka. I mean, Banno had no power, and it wasn't prevented by. That's just I'm going on Mr. Banno's testimony and his writing on the subject and what he has said.
Yeah,
Tanaka told Banno, "You are in charge, but Mr. Nakano is not the special effects director. There's only one. That's Mr. Tsuburaya. On this film, Mr. Nakano is the technical assistant, but Mr. Banno was ultimately in charge of both sides."
I see. It's almost that honorary position. He was Tanaka was trying to say, yeah, this is it's almost a legendary kind of position for Tsuburaya, but eventually that had to go away. It's not like the Hollywood system where someone who's accredited as this, that, or the other by union contract, they have to be accredited this way. And if you film this much of it or this much percent of it, you are considered director or assistant director. So I guess some of those are fungible titles, I guess you could say, during this time where everything isn't maybe so unionized and so regimented.
Well, yeah, excuse me. So, I mean, in terms of unions and stuff, excuse me, I don't have much to say about that. I can understand your point, though. Here, I think it was done perhaps out of respect. I don't know exactly, or maybe Mr. Nakano hadn't yet proven himself. But obviously, Submersion of Japan was such a big production that I guess they decided to credit him accordingly. But as I said, he didn't have a major reaction to it. It wasn't a big deal for him at the time. I guess that's because the work was still the same no matter what they called him. So it just didn't make much of an impact. But another thing that is on my website that I wanted to talk about was the creation of waves in the water. And this is something that we don't typically think about because it's not something that we tend to focus on. But Mr. Nakano really took the creation of waves seriously. And Mr. Asada, I mentioned him before, in the same interview, he talked about how they would be in the big pool, or they'd be around the big pool shooting, and they would start making the waves. And the waves would be going back and forth, and Mr. Nakano is wearing sunglasses, he's wearing the hat, so you can't really see his face very well. And they don't know what he's thinking. They can't read his face, but they're waiting for the cue. They're waiting for action, and he's not calling action. And the waves are being made, and then finally, when the waves are just right, then he'll say action. And again, that's a detail that none of us would ever even think about. I can't remember anyone ever talking about waves in tokusatsu. And that is something that he took so seriously that his crew was like, when's he going to call action? What are we waiting for? And they can't see his face because he's wearing sunglasses and a big hat that's covering, I'm sure you've seen that hat, in the photo. So, they couldn't read his face. They didn't know what he was thinking, but he would wait until just the right moment to do it. Contrast that with Mr. Kawakita, who according to Mr. Asada would just say action, regardless of he wouldn't care about it. It was just action, start.
The waves are fine. Yeah.
Yeah, the waves are fine.
But he really wanted that, I guess, that realism, and there was a particular look that I guess he was after. And I will say this from practical effects to get waves, sand, trees, shrubbery, things like this to work right, and movement in general, of something that's to appear large in scale is an art form within itself, and to trick the eye photorealistically is definitely is definitely something. If you ever get the chance to see visual effects artists react on YouTube, it's just, I'll give a little credit to them when they watched the 1984 Dune and they were talking about sand. You can't miniaturize sand.
Yep.
And so what did they do? They had these tiny little silicon whatever dust basically to create that idea of sand, and it's like it's going to get everywhere, it's very dangerous, you're going to breathe this stuff in. And so seeing Mr. Nakano's work in a lot of the films, and seeing just the fact of building collapse or the shrubs and brush that had to be planted and created so that when they reach down and grab something, that it's got the root structure and everything to make it look realistic. That's definitely something we don't think about. And the unfortunate, maybe, what do you want to call it? Stereotype of thinking is cardboard building. There was no cardboard. I mean, everything was meticulous in its design and creation, in how they would make things interact with the suit actors. It's unrivaled to today, to think about what went into that. So, I appreciate these stories. I appreciate finding out things like that, how meticulous waves can be, because I wouldn't know what to look for when it comes to that. I love seeing, I think there was that shot of an explosion that they used colors. What was that in? It wasn't in Atragon, was it? Where they were dropping colored dye in the water, filming it upside down to make an explosion that was happening at sea, things like that I wouldn't have even thought about. I can't remember what film it was, and if someone was in the chat, maybe they could correct me on what.
It sounds like it would be Atragon. That does sound accurate to me.
Yeah, I believe it was anyways, but seeing, how they would create something like that in practical, just fascinates me. It's not to take away from CGI. CGI is great and all it is, but when I explain it to people, it's like, well, yeah, you use a computer. These guys were inventing the stuff. These guys they were scrappy, and they were thinking outside of the box. They were creating the box to invent these effects. So seeing that, I would love to see what the incorrect waves look like, and then how they compare to the correct waves. And what film particularly was it? Maybe you mentioned it and I may have missed it, that he was very particular on the waves.
Well, no film was given, but I think in particular, probably like the war films that he did, like maybe Rengo Kantai or the Imperial Navy. I think those probably were what he was talking about. But he didn't. He said like generally, like Mr. Nakano was very concerned with the waves, not really related to any specific film. But I think for the war films in particular, that was a concern.
Okay.
And moving right along, because a couple of other notes of interest. I did have an occasion to ask him what he thought was his favorite film of the 70s that he worked on, and he mentioned Godzilla versus Mechagodzilla as his favorite. He also mentioned that he intentionally ended all of his Godzilla films in the 70s with Godzilla's back facing the camera. And he said that he did that to symbolize the fact that Godzilla was drifting away from the original intention of the original films and so forth. So it was kind of like a symbolic of Godzilla's drift from that, apparently. But if you look at all the films, yeah, they all end with Godzilla's back to the camera. He's walking away or swimming away or something like that.
Kind of a ride off into the sunset, but he's also the hero rather than somewhat the bad guy, I guess, in the 60s and 54 film. He's always kind of the bad guy in that so he's the force of nature, uncontrolled force of nature, but now he's the hero kind of character in the 70s. But yeah, you're right. Now that I'm thinking of it, he's always with his back to the camera. And so even 84, I mean, he's jumping in the jumping in the volcano, but his back's to the camera.
There you go. I didn't even think about that, but you're right. Yeah, his back. So maybe it continued on into 84. Who knows? True. So yeah. Other news and notes, because we kind of want to try to get everything in while we still can. Mr. Nakano once said, and I forgot about this, he was actually supposed to have an acting role in the movie Conflagration, which is also called Tokyo Bay Burns. But because he was so busy with his work, he didn't have time to act. And I do remember, I have a vague memory of there's a director character in that film, because it's kind of a meta tokusatsu film where they actually talk about special effects films within the film. If you've seen the story of the film, it all makes sense. But there is a director character, and he's wearing sunglasses, and he looks vaguely like Mr. Nakano. And I've always wondered if that was like an in-joke, if someone was doing that. So maybe he was intended to play that character, because he specifically did say he was supposed to be in Conflagration. So I did find that in my notes when I was researching this. You mentioned unions, so I think you'll be interested in this. Did you know that Mr. Nakano was approached to do the special effects for King Kong 76?
No, absolutely not. And that's, that would have been interesting. I'm really interested.
Yeah, he said, actually it was when Dave Filoni, who I think you saw that photo, because Dave Filoni came from Hollywood, Lucasfilm and so forth. And again, it was just one of those situations where, oh, you're from Hollywood. Well, I have a Hollywood connection, and you would never know to ask this. But he talked about how he was approached by Dino De Laurentiis, or at least Toho was approached by Dino De Laurentiis to do the special effects for King Kong. And apparently it was far enough into the process where Nakano himself went to New York to scout locations. But ultimately, because of unions, I guess maybe your favorite thing in the world, perhaps unions, there were some union problems, and they weren't allowed to bring in, non-union people from Japan to participate. So, they had to get Rick Baker. And again, Rick Baker he wasn't established yet. And maybe they looked at special effects from Toho, was like, oh, those guys know what they're doing. Rick Baker has done Octoman and Schlock. He hasn't done a whole lot. So, maybe it was a safer bet to try Toho. But yeah, it was unions, your favorite thing in the world, that prevented that from happening.
I more along the lines of have heard the stories of how either they help or hurt, in a lot of cases ruin something that could be a really cool project, or how the story of something like when someone asks what were they thinking, and it's like there's politics involved, and somehow this ended up the way it did. And so it's the case that it turns into the historical anecdotal story within the story that I find fascinating about how some of these things happen and why someone had to have their hands into why, you know, and I go back and again, one of my other favorite IPs, which is Dune, why David Lynch's name, you know, is not accredited in the director's cut of that. It's not director's, more like an extended cut, you know, using a name Alan Smithy or Judas Booth, you know, things like that. You know, why is that? Why is that? As a kid, I didn't get it. And as adult, I find those stories fascinating of the behind the scenes like this. And so, you know, hearing about Mr. Nakano and his experiences and how, you know, politics, they're not immune to these kinds of things either, even in tokusatsu films, whether union or non-union. And that's why I always I'm fascinated with the Toho studio system and even the classic Hollywood studio system that doesn't exist anymore, and how things have changed over time. You know, how that's why we see, you know, when I show my kids something and it's like, well, Mr. Takarada, okay, well, he was the big star in Godzilla 1954, but, you know, he's maybe this more minor role in this other film, or you know, he's the villain in Godzilla versus the Sea Monster. It's the studio system. It's, you know, it is just, you're assigned this role. Not necessarily because you're the big Tom Cruise star with your name emboldened over the top of it and your face on the cover in every poster. That's not the way they're going to run things. The story is the main character, isn't you know, Mr. Takarada or I'm trying to think, you know, anyone else that would be the big name actor for that. It is the story, and Godzilla, of course, is the main character in any of these, anyways. So, but yeah, that kind of way things have changed over the course of time, and even now with seeing Toho being the way it is, and you know, working with Tsuburaya and even on Shin Ultraman, and we've got Shin Godzilla, and all the politics that were involved in that. I mean, it shows through even in the film. I just find those stories kind of fascinating. Whether I agree or disagree with them, I just find them fascinating. But the 76 Kong, what kind of a Kong would we have had if we had Mr. Nakano in on the credits of that? And interestingly, how they compare Kong 76 with Godzilla 84, and so many comparisons of the different take on the realism of these creatures. I think there's something to be said about that. I mean, they even made a cover, a VHS and DVD cover of the 76 Kong with the 84 Godzilla, and it's the 62 King Kong versus Godzilla, which is neither one of those suits. You know, I find that, you know, really compelling. But that is interesting to see where he could have, and even Mr. Nakajima was even approached to do some Hollywood work at one point.
That's true too. Yes. Mm-hmm. And I've got about 10 minutes left, so I've just got a few news and notes, not news necessarily, but some notes left. So I want to try to get those in before we have to finish. I've got maybe 10 minutes, maybe a little less than that. One other note about the war in space, which is Toho's answer to Star Wars. There was a person out there, it might be the same guy who said that Tanaka told Banno that he ruined Godzilla. Might be the same source of that, I'm not sure. But he would often say on social media that Space Battleship Yamato really was the inspiration behind the war in space. Because most people would say, well, obviously it's Star Wars. You know, very famously, Mr. Tanaka went to Hawaii to catch a screening of Star Wars, because Star Wars was not released in Japan until 1978. But it was causing such a phenomenon that, you know, people were, you know, going crazy about it. It was hard to ignore, even though it wasn't released in the country. So I had an occasion to ask Mr. Nakano about, you know, what really happened. I mean, was it Star Wars? Was it Space Battleship Yamato? I mean, what happened? And so I asked him, like, which one was the inspiration? And Mr. Nakano said, neither. It was actually old pirate movies.
Really? Okay.
Which I guess if you look at, you know, certainly the designs of the film, like, you know, certainly one of them, you know, looks like an old pirate ship.
Yeah.
Which is kind of interesting. But that's what he said, you know, so he didn't say anything about Space Battleship Yamato, which I was told by a reliable source was the real inspiration for the war in space. But He didn't say anything about that. He said neither, not that or Star Wars. So take that for what you will. But I do want to say this because we're running low on time, and I do want to talk about a personal story, not related to any of the films or anything like that. Back in 2012, there was a birthday event for Mr. Nakano, and they would often have these birthday events for him over the years. But this one was particularly special because, and it was a very unusual thing because we went to a bathhouse. And I don't know if you know anything about Japanese bathhouses, but you get fully naked in them. You take off all your clothes. You cannot wear any clothes. And the idea is you can go to the bathhouse with Mr. Nakano, which again is a common thing in Japan.
It's cultural.
It's a cultural thing. Like when I started working in schools, 10 years ago, whatever it was, they invited me during the summer. Hey, let's all go to the bathhouse. So I got naked with all my coworkers in the bathhouse. I mean, that's just the way it is. And so I had an opportunity to get naked with Mr. Nakano. And I did. And I did it on 2 different occasions. One was in 2015. And so what you would do is before you would get into the water, it was a big honor to wash the senior person's back. So I washed Mr. Nakano's back while we had no clothes on whatsoever. One thing I did notice is that he had a very big scar on his back, and I never knew what it was from. It was not. It was obviously surgical because the lines were very surgical. It wasn't like jagged, like it was an accident. It was obviously some kind of surgery, but it was huge. It was like they really opened up his back. I don't know if that's common for back surgery or not, but that's what I saw. But I washed his back both times, and we went into the water together. And there's other people there, so it wasn't just me and him. It was a whole group of people. But he did mention at the time that afterwards, we went to dinner, and he said that he felt it was a big honor to have a foreigner and there washing his back, and he said that it's going to be a memory that he's going to take with him to heaven. So I felt truly honored, when he said that. Another thing too is, I interviewed him and first met him back in 2004, and I didn't see him again until 2011 when I was in Japan. And he was a guest at an event where, it was very much like a cattle call for people. Like you go through your line, he gives you something, next person. So there's no time to really talk to anybody. And I hadn't seen him since then. So a lot of years have passed. And as I'm going through the line, I greet him and he goes, oh, he's surprised to see me. And I'm like, could he really remember me? Because it's been so long. And I wasn't sure if he was just surprised to see a foreigner at an event like that or if he recognized me. But the next time I saw him, which was the next year, I asked him, did you remember me? And he said, yes, I do remember you. So, again, it was just, it was wonderful to hang out with him. I mean, I'll say this, you mentioned what he did at the end after he retired. Well, he worked on some theme parks, but he was a regular guy, Mr. Kawakita, he had his own private company. He was always selling something, and that's more power to him. I mean, that's certainly within his right. I'm not criticizing him for that. But Mr. Kawakita was always a businessman, and he was always interested in doing something business related. Mr. Nakano wasn't. Mr. Nakano was just a regular guy. He was happy to hang out. He wanted to talk tokusatsu. He wanted to share tokusatsu with people. And to me, that was kind of the main takeaway if I'm going to compare the two of them. Mr. Kawakita was kind of business, and not a bad guy. I mean, he was never, bad to me or angry with me or anything like that. But I mean, you could tell that there are certain people who are just business, and there are some people who are just folks. They're regular people. And Mr. Nakano was definitely one of the regular people. So I still can't believe he's gone, because I would see him so often at these events, and his present, I would always try to ask him something, because he was a wealth of knowledge. And, I regret I'll never get that interview that I really wanted to really dive deep into this stuff. COVID had played a role in that. He wanted to wait till after COVID to do it. But again, it's just we ran out of time, and it's very unfortunate. But always remember him, I'll always miss him. He was always great to me. What a true gentleman he was, one of the nicest people I've met in Japan. And I want to thank you for the opportunity to have me on to talk about him, because, you know, he was a true gentleman. I look at some of those pictures and it just reminds me of some of the great memories I have. And I'll always cherish those memories, and I'll cherish the things he told me. You know, some of the things that I got out of his book, but a lot of these things were things that he told me directly or told a group of us directly. You know, so there's some stuff here that I don't know if it's in his book or not, and it may not be out there really, but, you know, you get to hear it here. So, you know, there you go. That's you know, the way it is.
Yes, and what a story, and what a beyond the him being into filmmaking, beyond him into being, you know, leaving the legacy he did, to have that personal relationship with him, and really, like you did, immerse yourself into the culture, and what an honor it would be. I would have been honored, honestly, to do this, to be in your position that way, but to have that that connection, that relationship, that's incredible. And yes, what a shame we've lost him, but as he said, you know, it's something he took with him. So I think that's fantastic. You've been very generous with your time, and I know we could talk forever on this. And I would say, if you're willing, that we could talk about on another day, on another topics of some of the other cast members' legacy that we have lost over the years. We have lost many, and you know, when I try to make posts, especially on social media, I try to remember both birth dates and anniversary of passing dates, because I feel those are important as well, and to keep that memory alive of them, because they have made such an impact on our lives, and not to forget them. And so I really appreciate the work that you have done in putting it out there on social media, on Vantage Point Interviews, for us to digest and get into. And I really appreciate your time here. So thank you so much. And I encourage people to follow Brett at Vantage Point Interviews on Facebook. Any other sites or plugs that you would like as we close up here?
There's sidelong glances of a pigeonkicker.blogspot.com. I know I wish I called it something else, but I was like, I wanted to come up with a stupid name for my blog, because I thought people who have blogs are kind of self-important. So I thought if I call it something really stupid, it'll signal that I don't take this seriously. But then I've got all this like Toho stuff on there, rare photos and stuff. And it's like, why did I do that? But, you know, it's too late to change it. But that's out there. But thank you very much. I appreciate your kind words. I appreciate your having me on. We'll do it again. I really have to get off now, but thank you again, and we'll be in touch soon. And yeah, we'll certainly do another show, so we'll be in touch about that.
All right. Thank you, everyone who's joining us on the Monster Report and seeing this on the replay. Like, subscribe, comment, hit that notification bell, all of those things. Follow Brett on social media, especially Vantage Point Interviews, and I will leave a link in the description for both his blog space and for Vantage Point Interviews. So thank you again. This is Nick Adam Poling signing off for the Monster Report, and Brett Homenick joining us from Japan. Thank you again, and we will catch you next time.
Thank you very much.